What does it really mean to lose one's mind? We often imagine it as a sudden collapse, a sharp break where someone simply snaps. But madness rarely arrives like lightning. It creeps like water under stone, softening the foundations until, one day, the surface gives way. The collapse feels sudden only because the fractures were hidden from view. For many men, those fractures begin early. A father absent or present in body, but distant in spirit. A home where love was conditional, or silence louder than affection. These wounds do not scream at first. They wait. They wait in the nervous system, in the shaping of cortisol and adrenaline, in the unspoken belief that tenderness is dangerous and self-reliance is the only safe ground. Childhood leaves behind silent explosives buried in the psyche, and adulthood becomes the minefield. The psyche, in this sense, is less like a fortress and more like a city. On the surface, streets may look orderly, buildings solid, life functioning as usual. But beneath, sinkholes form where foundations were never repaired. One day, under the weight of stress, grief, or betrayal, the street caves in. To outside eyes, it looks like sudden madness. Inside, it is simply the last domino tipping after years of carefully hidden imbalance. This is why losing one's mind is not the beginning of chaos. It is the conclusion of years spent holding it together. Small denials, repressed truths, the performance of strength while the body carries storms. Jung called it the shadow, those exiled parts of ourselves we push out of awareness, yet which continue to act through us. When the pressure grows too great, the shadow bursts the seams of persona, the mask we wear to be acceptable. What collapses is not sanity itself, but the fragile scaffolding built to keep the pain out of sight. And yet, in our culture, collapse is punished. Vulnerability is mocked or pathologized. Society glorifies control, the man who never falters, the professional who always delivers, the partner who never wavers. But no mask can be worn forever. When it shatters, the world often recoils, pointing to the broken man as a cautionary tale, when in truth he is simply carrying what many others have only managed to hide. To understand madness is to understand pressure. To understand collapse is to trace the long road of silence, shame, and the small betrayals of self that preceded it. This is not about weakness. It is about weight, about the human cost of pretending to be invulnerable while living inside a body that remembers every wound. So before we speak of techniques or practices or even hope, we must begin here, in the raw recognition that the mind becomes a battlefield when shadows are denied their place in the light. Losing one's mind is not a random curse. It is the language of pain, finally refusing to be ignored. As we move forward, hold this image, the city with hidden sinkholes, not to frighten, but to remind. Every collapse has its story. Every breakdown traces back to the unhealed foundations of a life. And perhaps, if we can read those fractures with compassion, we may find that madness is not only a fall, but also a doorway. The hidden wound, madness, as the echo of a fatherless archetype. Every story of collapse begins with a silence. Sometimes that silence is the absence of a father. Sometimes it is his body present, but his eyes elsewhere, buried in work, in alcohol, in his own unresolved ghosts. For the boy, the absence becomes a question. Am I worthy of attention? Am I strong enough without a guide? That question, unanswered, grows into a quiet storm. Jung described the father as not only a man, but an archetype, the figure that gives structure, orientation, and boundary to the developing psyche. When that archetype is hollow, chaos often fills the space. A boy without the presence of a grounded father may grow into a man who wears defiance like armor. He tells himself he is independent, untouchable, stronger without reliance. But beneath the bravado sits grief, and grief unacknowledged often mutates into rage. Neuroscience confirms what myth has long whispered. Chronic neglect or emotional distance in childhood elevates cortisol, the stress hormone. When this elevation becomes the child's normal state, the brain adapts. The amygdala, the alarm system, grows hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of impulse control and clear reasoning, weakens its grip. What emerges is not madness in itself, but a nervous system trained to expect abandonment, danger, and betrayal. The man who carries this wound often lives with the constant hum of threat, even in moments of calm. Outwardly, this can look like rebellion, the teenager who pushes every boundary, the adult who distrusts authority, rejects intimacy, or fights invisible enemies. Yet rebellion here is not pure defiance. It is grief in disguise. It is the child's cry, armored by aggression, declaring, "I needed you, and you were not there." The tragedy is that the anger hides the wound so well that even the man himself cannot see its true shape. He believes his rage is his essence, when in fact, it is his shield. Consider the story of Vincent van Gogh, a man whose art pulsed with color and intensity, yet whose life unraveled in waves of breakdowns. Historians often debate whether he suffered from epilepsy, psychosis, or depression. But beneath the diagnoses lies a simpler truth. Van Gogh lived with a profound sense of rejection and isolation. His breakdowns were not only collapse but also revelation, moments where the unbearable weight of his shadow erupted into expression on canvas. His madness was not random. It was a mirror of his unmet longing, painted into the world because no one had held it within him. For many men today, the fatherless archetype continues its silent work. Some drown it in achievement, hoping success will prove their worth. Others chase intensity, drugs, danger, or chaotic relationships, trying to fill the void with noise. And some retreat into numbness, building a shell of control so rigid it eventually cracks under its own pressure. The echo of the absent father is not just personal. It reverberates across generations, a wound inherited and passed on until someone dares to name it. There is a way to meet this wound without being swallowed by it. Imagine taking 3 moments with a page before you. In the first, you let the rage speak, the raw, unfiltered voice of the child who was not held. In the second, you rewrite the narrative, not erasing the wound, but reframing it as a fact of history, not a verdict on worth. And in the third, you reframe the energy, asking, what strength was born from surviving this absence, and how can it be used for life rather than destruction? This is not therapy in itself, but it is a ritual of reclaiming. Rage, rewrite, reframe. The simple act of giving voice where silence once ruled. The echo of a fatherless archetype will not disappear overnight, but naming it is already defiance against the chaos it breeds. When rebellion is recognized as grief, the armor can soften, and what remains beneath is not madness, but a man who was always longing for presence, guidance, and the right to belong. The trap of projection, when the anima becomes a demon lover. In Jung's map of the psyche, the anima is the inner feminine image within a man, the part of him that connects to emotion, imagination, and intimacy. When she is wounded, when his early experiences taught him that love equals absence or betrayal, that anima becomes distorted. She doesn't vanish. She lives in the psyche like a ghost, waiting to be projected outward. And so again and again, the man finds himself drawn to women who carry the very pattern of unavailability that shaped his first attachments. This is where projection begins its trap. He sees her not as she is, but as his wounded anima clothed in flesh. What feels like destiny is often repetition. What feels like chemistry is often the psyche's attempt to resolve an old wound by reenacting it. The unavailable partner, the chaotic romance, the cycle of hope and despair, these are not accidents. They are echoes. Neuroscience gives this old myth a biological edge. Trauma bonding is not just poetic language. It is measurable. When a relationship cycles between affection and withdrawal, the brain is caught in a loop of dopamine and cortisol. Dopamine fuels the high of reunion. Cortisol marks the sting of rejection. Together they mimic love, but what they truly produce is dependency. The nervous system becomes addicted not to the partner, but to the oscillation itself, the push and pull, the tension and relief. What chains the man is not devotion, but chemistry. Obsession, then, is not proof of love. It is evidence of self-abandonment. The psyche, longing for wholeness, has outsourced its anima to another person and clings to her as if without her, it cannot survive. This is why the pull toward toxic partners feels so consuming. It is not only a romance, it is the unconscious belief that without this mirror, one's inner feminine will be lost forever. There is a way to feel this distinction, not in theory, but in the body. When attraction flares, pause, not as an instruction, but as an experiment. Bring awareness down from thought into sensation. Scan the body slowly, the chest, the stomach, the breath. Ask not, do I love her, but what is my nervous system telling me? If the attraction feels like urgency, like a fire that must be fed or else it will consume you, chances are it is trauma speaking. If the attraction feels grounded, curious, expansive rather than desperate, then perhaps it is resonance rather than repetition. Culture has mirrored this pattern in its myths. The story of Joker and Harley Quinn has been romanticized as a tale of passion, but beneath the colors and chaos lies the psychology of trauma bonding. Joker, wounded and destructive, becomes the magnet. Harley, captivated, loses herself in his gravity. The world frames it as erotic madness, but in truth it is the anima and animus distorted, clinging not to love, but to the familiar shape of pain. Many men secretly recognize themselves in that mirror, ashamed to admit how easily they too confuse obsession with devotion. The demon lover, then, is not an external villain alone. She is the projection of the anima unhealed, calling the man back to face the places he has abandoned within himself. Until he retrieves her inwardly, through recognition, through reclaiming his capacity to feel, to create, to belong, she will continue to appear outwardly, wrapped in faces that wound as much as they allure. When Jung said that projection is one of the greatest sources of illusion in life, he meant this very loop. To break it is not to deny attraction or to distrust intimacy. It is to see clearly. Sometimes the one we cannot stop thinking about is not a soulmate, but a shadow play. Sometimes what feels like love is the psyche's desperate attempt to finally touch its own anima, the silent poison of perfectionism, the mind as a prison guard. Perfectionism often wears the mask of discipline. To the outside world, it looks like ambition, high standards, relentless drive. But beneath that mask hides something darker. Perfectionism is rarely the pursuit of excellence. It is more often the fear of being exposed. A prison guard disguised as a coach, keeping the self locked inside an impossible standard. This tyrannical inner critic is not born out of nowhere. It is sculpted in comparison, in shame, in the subtle or harsh messages that worth must be earned through flawlessness. For some, it began with the voice of a parent. Do better. Be stronger. Don't fail. For others, it was the unspoken demand of culture. A man must be unbreakable, always in control, always superior. Over time, these messages internalize. The voice becomes one's own, echoing day and night, turning life into a performance judged by an invisible jury. Psychology has a name for this loop: the Pygmalion effect turned inward. Just as expectations can lift a student to greater achievement, they can also crush a soul when set beyond human capacity. The perfectionist demands so much of himself that he begins to suffocate under his own expectations. And when he inevitably fails to meet them, the critic only grows louder, convinced that punishment will enforce improvement. It is a cycle without end. The higher the bar, the deeper the collapse. The counterintuitive truth is that perfectionism is not courage. It is avoidance. It is a refusal to risk the vulnerability of imperfection. To present something 90% complete feels terrifying because it means risking rejection as oneself, not as the polished mask. And yet, paradoxically, only by risking imperfection does the self ever taste freedom. The critic claims it is keeping us safe from shame. In reality, it traps us in a life where nothing is ever enough. Neuroscience maps this trap as well. When the brain is locked into perfectionist rumination, the stress response remains active. Cortisol lingers, sleep suffers, focus narrows into obsession. The nervous system lives in a state of perpetual vigilance, as if the next mistake will be catastrophic. Over time, this erodes not only confidence but health. The body pays for the psyche's prison. Listen to the testimonies that surface in anonymous corners of the internet. Men who chase the image of the unbreakable male, always working, always training, always projecting strength, until their bodies burned out and their spirits collapsed. They confess not to weakness, but to exhaustion, to the unbearable weight of carrying a fantasy that could never be real. Their stories are not outliers. They are mirrors of a cultural wound. there is an alternative rhythm. Some call it the 90% rule, the willingness to act when something feels nearly ready, though not perfect. This is not about lowering standards, but about retraining the nervous system to tolerate incompletion, to risk the rawness of imperfection, and discover that life does not end when flaws are visible. Each step taken at 90% is an act of quiet rebellion against the inner tyrant. Perfectionism promises safety, but delivers suffocation. The way out is not grand achievement, but humble permission. To see that courage is not producing the flawless, but standing as oneself without disguise. Peace is not found in finally meeting the impossible standard. Peace is found when the prison guard is unmasked, and the self is allowed to breathe, the collapse of identity. Persona versus self. Every man wears a mask, not a mask of deception, but of necessity. Jung called it the persona, the part of us designed to meet the demands of society. The worker, the leader, the friend, the partner. Each role is a performance, a necessary adaptation to survive in a world that expects order and predictability. The mask itself is not the problem. It becomes a problem when the mask fuses with the face, when the persona swells so large that the deeper self is suffocated beneath it. The self is the core, the living center that holds contradictions, shadow, and potential. Unlike the persona, it doesn't need applause. It does not perform. It simply is. Yet because the self is raw, unpredictable, and often inconvenient, it is exiled. Men learn early to identify with the mask instead. The good son, the reliable employee, the stoic partner. The tragedy comes when the mask, meant to be flexible, hardens into identity. The man forgets who he is when the performance ends. Neuroscience reflects this collapse. When the brain's default mode network, the circuitry tied to self-referential thinking, becomes overactive, rumination takes over. The mind loops endlessly. Am I enough? What do they think of me? What happens if I fail? This mental overdrive correlates with anxiety, depression, even identity breakdown. The more the persona dominates, the more the self withers, until collapse becomes inevitable. From the outside, this collapse looks like burnout, midlife crisis, or sudden rebellion. From the inside, it feels like suffocation. The roles that once brought pride now feel like chains. The man who was once the provider or the leader suddenly cannot breathe within those titles. He begins to sabotage, to lash out, or to retreat into despair. What the world calls breakdown is often the self-demanding air. There is an inversion hidden here. Collapse, painful as it is, can also be breakthrough. When the persona fractures, what leaks through the cracks is often more real than the polished mask ever was. The anger, the grief, the longing, all of it is the self-reclaiming space. Madness, in this sense, is not just disintegration. It is also an initiation, forcing the man to ask, "Who am I?" when the roles fall away. A simple ritual can bring this into focus. Write down the 3 roles most performed each day: worker, partner, friend. Then ask, not as an exercise to complete, but as an inquiry to sit with. Who am I when none of these are required? What remains when the mask is set aside? The question itself may unsettle, even frighten, because it reveals how much of identity has been outsourced to performance. But within that unsettling lies freedom. Culture has offered mirrors of this collapse. The film Fight Club dramatizes the persona breaking under the weight of conformity. A nameless man hollowed by consumer life creates an alter ego to rebel. The story is not about soap or anarchy. It is about the psyche's desperate attempt to reclaim authenticity from suffocation. The destruction is violent, yet beneath it lies the hunger for truth. The collapse of identity is rarely graceful. It tears away certainty, leaving confusion and fear. Yet if endured with honesty, it clears a path back to the self, the part that does not need the mask to exist. In this way, breakdown becomes less a failure of character and more a rite of passage. The persona cracking so that the self can finally breathe, the seduction of numbness, escaping pain through compulsion. When the weight of pain grows unbearable, the mind seeks escape. Sometimes that escape comes in the form of alcohol, pornography, endless scrolling, or reckless risk-taking. From the outside, these behaviors look like failures of discipline. From the inside, they are rituals of survival. Compulsion is rarely about pleasure. It is about anesthesia. The man does not crave the drink, the screen, or the thrill itself. He craves relief from the silence that roars inside him. Jung would describe this as a shadow wound. The pain that cannot be faced consciously finds its outlet in behaviors that numb, distract, or flood the body with chemicals more tolerable than sorrow. Neuroscience adds clarity here. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward, becomes hijacked. Each compulsion, whether sexual, chemical, or digital, offers a spike of dopamine, a brief escape from despair. But the brain, in chasing that spike, adjusts its baseline downward. Relief shrinks, craving grows, and the void that drove the compulsion in the first place becomes deeper. This is why cycles of relapse feel so shameful. The man tells himself he has failed, that he is weak, that he has no self-control. But the truth is different. Relapse is not proof of moral failure. It is the body signaling unmet needs. The compulsion itself is a distorted attempt at self-regulation. It is the psyche saying, "I cannot hold this pain any longer without relief." Understanding this does not excuse destructive behavior, but it reframes it as a call for compassion rather than condemnation. The twist is that compulsions are not meaningless. They are rituals. Misguided, yes, but rituals nonetheless. They show us where the psyche is already reaching for regulation, though in forms that fragment rather than integrate. To shift them is not to destroy the ritual, but to redirect it. What if the same urge to soothe could be answered by practices that bring the body into balance rather than collapse? 3 minutes of cold water immersion to shock the nervous system back to presence. A brief session of breath work to clear adrenaline from the bloodstream. Weighted movement, picking up something heavy, grounding strength into the muscles, to replace chaos with solidity. These replacements are not punishments. They are not meant to suppress desire, but to translate it. They acknowledge that the need for relief is real, while offering the nervous system new ways to return to center. They do not erase the void, but they teach the body that pain can be held without destruction. In online forums, countless men speak with raw honesty about this cycle. They describe relapse not as a loss of willpower, but as a moment of drowning. One man wrote that each time he returned to pornography, it was not lust driving him, but loneliness. Another admitted that alcohol was not about celebration, but about silencing the voice that whispered he was unworthy. Their words reveal what the science confirms. Compulsion is the language of unmet need. The seduction of numbness will always be strong because it offers immediate relief. But relief is not the same as healing. To face compulsion with compassion is to hear what it is trying to say. Beneath the behavior lies the body's desperate attempt to survive the storm. To see this is not to justify the cycle, but to finally recognize its hidden message. You are not weak for seeking numbness. You are wounded, and your nervous system is still searching for safety. The archetypal battle, when the warrior turns against himself. At the core of the masculine psyche lives the archetype of the warrior. This figure is not merely about violence or conquest, but about direction, discipline, and the capacity to endure. The warrior energy fuels ambition, protects boundaries, and channels strength toward purpose. Yet when this energy is misdirected or left without a clear goal, it collapses inward. The warrior, deprived of a battlefield that matters, begins to fight himself. This collapse is not weakness. It is strength without a channel. When the warrior's drive for conquest has no worthy object, it turns its sharpness upon the very man who carries it. Self-destruction is often the shadow of untamed power. Anger, once meant to defend, corrodes into bitterness. Discipline, once meant to build, mutates into obsession. The sword of the warrior, no longer raised in protection, becomes a blade turned against the self. Philosophy has long spoken to this truth. Nietzsche reminded us, "He who has a why can bear any how." Purpose does not remove suffering, but it gives suffering a shape. When the why collapses, when direction fades, the how becomes unbearable. Many breakdowns in men are not the fruit of lack, but of abundance misdirected. Energy without orientation. Strength with nowhere to land. History mirrors this pattern. Consider the generals who thrived in war, but unraveled when peace arrived. Stripped of battle, their identity crumbled. The fight had given them clarity, even meaning. Without it, the warrior energy turned inward, manifesting as depression, alcoholism, or reckless destruction. Their collapse was not caused by cowardice, but by the loss of an external battlefield that once carried their fire. There is a way to bring this conflict into clarity. Picture a map divided into two columns. On one side, battles worth fighting, those aligned with values, rooted in integrity, serving something larger than ego. On the other, battles that drain, fights for approval, contests of pride, addictions to proving worth. When laid bare, the distinction is stark. Many men discover that most of their energy bleeds into the second column, leaving little for what actually matters. The result is exhaustion without fulfillment, conquest without peace. The inner war can be brutal. A man may appear powerful, disciplined, successful, and yet his nights are filled with restlessness, his mornings with dread. He feels the clash inside him, the warrior spirit searching for a cause that resonates. Without it, every achievement feels hollow, every victory like ash. The breakdown that follows is less about incapacity and more about starvation, the starvation of meaning. And yet within the collapse lies an invitation. When the warrior finally sees that turning the blade inward only deepens the wound, he faces a choice: to numb himself into oblivion, or to seek a battlefield aligned with soul. This does not always mean grand quests or heroic missions. Sometimes it means protecting one's integrity in small decisions, building something that will last beyond the self, or standing firm in values even when no applause follows. The essence of the warrior is not in conquest for its own sake, but in service to what is worth enduring for. When this alignment returns, the war quiets. The blade is lifted not against the self, but in defense of the life one is meant to live. The energy that once corroded from within becomes the very fire that carries a man forward. Breakdown, in this light, is not the end of the warrior, but his redirection. The implosion becomes a turning point, the moment he stops waging war on himself and begins to fight for what is truly his to guard rebuilding the inner house after the fire. When a man loses his mind, it often feels like the end of everything. The collapse of roles, the shattering of masks, the surrender to compulsions, the battles turned inward. All of it creates the impression that life itself has burned to ash. And in a sense, it has. The identity once carefully built no longer stands. The persona that once carried him through the world is fractured. What remains looks like ruin, but ruin is not the final word. Nature itself teaches us this. After a forest fire, the land seems barren, scarred, lifeless. Yet beneath the charred soil, seeds wait. The fire, as brutal as it was, has cleared what was choking them. Ash becomes fertilizer. In time, green shoots appear. A different forest grows, one not identical to the old, but rooted in what could not have sprouted otherwise. Losing one's mind in this sense is like the fire. It burns away illusions, masks, and false foundations. What is left is raw, but it is also fertile ground. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole, not by perfecting the mask, but by integrating the shadow, reclaiming the exiled parts of the self, and living from a center rather than from performance. Madness, reframed, is not simply a fall. It is an initiation. A brutal initiation, yes, but one that strips away the unnecessary so that the essential can emerge. The task, then, is not to rebuild the same house that burned, brick for brick. It is to build differently, to use roots instead of masks, to anchor identity not in roles alone, but in the deeper self that can hold both strength and fragility. This rebuilding does not happen overnight. It unfolds slowly, in moments of honesty, in rituals of regulation, in conversations that do not demand performance. It is measured not in perfection, but in integration. Every fragment of collapse can become raw material. The anger reveals passion once denied. The grief shows the depth of longing. The compulsions point to needs that demand gentler care. Even the shame, when met with compassion, becomes a teacher of humility and empathy. Nothing is wasted, unless it is ignored. So perhaps the question is not, how do I avoid madness? But, what can be born after the mask shatters? To lose one's mind is to be stripped of what no longer serves. To rebuild is to choose differently. To live with a spine of integrity, rather than a mask of control. And maybe the invitation is this: Take the fragments not as evidence of failure, but as building blocks. Not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. Not toward invulnerability, but toward sovereignty, the capacity to stand rooted, even when storms come. Individuation is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming real. So the fire, though devastating, is not the end. It is the clearing. What grows after may not look like the old forest, but it can be truer, deeper, and more alive. The battlefield of shadows does not disappear, but when met with honesty and compassion, it no longer consumes. It becomes part of the terrain of a man who, having lost his mind, finds instead his self.